I watched security pull my 14-year-old nephew Marcus off the dance floor by his arm. His mother, my sister Jennifer, was already on her feet, her face gone the color of wet concrete. The groom's mother, a woman whose name I'd learned approximately 4 minutes before she started screaming, was pointing at Marcus like he'd shown up with a loaded weapon instead of a corsage for his date. "He doesn't belong here," she was hissing, loud enough that heads turned 3 tables over. "This is a private event, a family event." Her husband stood beside her, nodding like one of those bobblehead dogs, his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping. And me, I just sat there in my navy dress, a glass of Prosecco halfway to my lips, trying to understand what exactly was happening. Jennifer's hands were shaking as she reached for Marcus. The boy looked confused, betrayed, like someone had just told him Santa wasn't real and also that he was adopted. I'd arrive at this wedding thinking I knew everyone involved. I was about to learn that I didn't know anything at all. But let me back up. Let me tell you how we got here, because the real story didn't start on the dance floor at the Riverside Country Club. It started 3 weeks earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday morning when my sister called me from her car. The past 6 months had been good for Jennifer. That's what everyone said anyway, that she was finally in a good place. Her ex-husband, Marcus Sr., had been out of the picture for almost 2 years by that point. And while the divorce had been messy in the way divorces always are, Jennifer had clawed her way back to something resembling stability. She worked as a medical assistant at a dermatology practice, made decent money, owned a modest 3-bedroom house in Riverside with a mortgage she could actually afford. Marcus spent alternate weekends with his dad and had a therapist who specialized in helping kids process parental separation. By all accounts, they were doing fine. Better than fine. Jennifer had even started dating again. Carefully, thoughtfully. Nothing serious. She'd learned her lesson about rushing into things. But then she met David Chen at the grocery store of all places. He was reaching for the same organic, free-range chicken she wanted, and they'd both laughed about it. And somehow that laugh had turned into coffee, and coffee had turned into dinner, and dinner had turned into something that looked like it might actually have legs. David was a partner at his firm, something corporate, something with money attached to it. He had a condo downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows, a Tesla that he'd let Marcus sit in while it was parked, and the kind of easy confidence that comes from a lifetime of things working out exactly as planned. He was handsome in a conventional way, the kind of guy who looked good in photographs. He made Jennifer laugh. He was attentive. He remembered what she'd said about preferring sparkling water to regular. These were the things Jennifer told me about him during our Sunday coffee runs, and I'd listened and nodded and asked the right follow-up questions. I was happy for her, genuinely. She deserved someone kind. She'd spent 5 years with Marcus Sr., who had the emotional availability of a brick and the fidelity of a stray tomcat. David seemed different. David seemed solid. The wedding invitation came on a Tuesday. It was for David's best friend, a guy named Brandon whose fiancée Ashley came from what Jennifer described as a really prominent family. The ceremony was at their country club. The reception was catered. There would be a sit-down dinner and dancing and probably an open bar. Jennifer had shown me the invitation over FaceTime, turning it over in her hands like it was made of spun glass. "David's bringing me as his +1, she'd said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. It felt significant to her, like it meant something. Meeting his friends, being integrated into his world. The wedding was set for a Saturday in June, and Jennifer had spent the 2 weeks leading up to it doing what women do before these events. She'd bought a dress, had her hair done, gotten a manicure, stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom for extended periods of time, checking angles. I'd helped her pick out the dress, a navy thing that made her look elegant and put together, like someone who had her life arranged in neat, orderly files. She'd looked beautiful. I'd told her so. She'd seemed nervous but excited, the way you are before you step into a room where you don't know many people but really want to make a good impression. Marcus had seemed fine about it all. The plan was that he'd stay with his father that weekend. Marcus Sr. had agreed to it weeks in advance. There was nothing unusual about it. The boy had his dad's apartment, his room there set up with his things, his Xbox. He spent every other weekend there anyway. But then on the Friday night before the wedding, Jennifer had gotten a call. Marcus Sr.'s girlfriend, his latest girlfriend, a woman named Tanya who worked at a salon and who seemed to change every 18 months, had gotten sick. Food poisoning, apparently. Marcus Sr. had decided he needed to stay home and take care of her. Jennifer had been frustrated. I remember her telling me about it. She'd already paid for her salon appointment, already bought the dress. But she couldn't leave Marcus alone for the night, and her ex's schedule change was hardly her problem to solve. So she'd called David. And David, being David, had offered a solution. "Bring him," he'd said. "It's a big event. Lots of kids will be there." Brandon's cousins, probably his nephews. "Marcus can hang out with them. He can even come to the reception if he wants. I don't mind." Jennifer had hesitated. The wedding wasn't really a kid-friendly event, and she knew that. But David had been so casual about it, so assured that it would be fine. And she was tired and frustrated, and the path of least resistance suddenly seemed like the right one. "You're sure?" she'd asked him. "Completely sure," he'd said. "Don't worry about it. I'll keep an eye on him." So the plan had changed. Instead of staying with his father, Marcus would come to the wedding. He'd wear his good pants and his button-up shirt. He'd sit at Jennifer's table during dinner. He'd try not to be bored during the ceremony. It seemed fine. It seemed manageable. It seemed like the kind of thing that happens all the time at weddings. Kids showing up because childcare arrangements fell through, because the logistics of adult life are messy and imperfect. Nobody said anything about it when they arrived. David had greeted them both at the club entrance, had kissed Jennifer on the cheek, had put a hand on Marcus's shoulder and told him he looked sharp. Everything had been normal. Everything had seemed fine. And then, 2 hours later, everything had stopped being fine. Jennifer had excused herself to use the restroom after dinner, and when she'd come back, she'd found David's expression changed. He was looking at her in a way she couldn't quite read. When she'd asked what was wrong, he'd said nothing, just something about needing to talk to her after the reception, when they had privacy. The unease had started then. A small thing, barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. Like the first time you notice your car making a sound it shouldn't make. You ignore it at first, but you notice it. And later, you'll remember that you noticed it. Later, you'll think about how the warning signs were always there, how you walked right past them like they were invisible. Hashtag Final Collision and Reckoning. David didn't respond to Jennifer's calls that Sunday. By Monday morning, when Marcus asked his mom if something was wrong, she told him everything was fine. But it wasn't. Her voice had that careful brightness people use when they're lying to children. Marcus was 14. He could hear the difference between fine and fine. Jennifer sat at her kitchen table with her coffee growing cold, staring at the email David had finally sent at 11:47 p.m. Sunday night. No phone call, no face-to-face conversation, an email. "I think it's best if we take some space," he'd written. "My family has expressed some concerns and I think they're valid. I'm sorry." Valid concerns, as if Marcus's existence was a policy decision to be workshopped at a family dinner. She'd read it 4 times, waiting for it to make sense, waiting for some version of the words to appear that would explain what had actually happened at that wedding. By Tuesday, she still didn't have answers. She'd texted David asking to talk. Radio silence. She'd called, straight to voicemail. She'd even driven by his condo downtown, and his car wasn't there. It was like he'd evaporated the moment the ceremony ended, like the entire relationship had been written in disappearing ink. The not knowing was worse than any explicit cruelty. At least cruelty meant he'd cared enough to be honest about his revulsion. Marcus was struggling too. He'd started the week acting like nothing had happened, but Jennifer watched him in the mornings before school, saw how he moved through the house like he was taking up too much space. He'd asked once, carefully, if David was coming over this weekend. Jennifer had said no. He hadn't asked why. He was old enough to understand that some things don't have good answers. It was her friend Rachel, the one who'd warned her about moving too fast, who changed everything. Rachel had been at the wedding. She'd been at the table next to theirs, which meant she'd seen the whole thing unfold in real time. On Wednesday night, over wine at Jennifer's kitchen table, Rachel finally told her the full story. "I was in the restroom," Rachel said, her voice tight with anger, "when I overheard 2 women talking in the lounge. One of them was David's mother. The other was the groom's mother, Ashley's mom. And they were talking about you. About Marcus." She paused, taking a long sip of wine. The groom's mother said something like, "I don't care if David's serious about her. We cannot have that boy at our events. It reflects poorly on the family." And David's mother just agreed. She said it was a complication she hadn't anticipated when David started dating you. Jennifer felt the floor tilt. "What do you mean, reflects poorly?" Rachel hesitated. "They were talking about him being black, Jen. That's what they meant." The groom's mother said it directly. "These country clubs have a certain standard. We have to maintain certain standards." And then she asked if David knew what he was getting into, and his mother said she'd have a talk with him about his choices. The room went quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Jennifer couldn't feel her hands. She'd known, intellectually, that racism existed. She'd taught Marcus about it, prepared him for a world that wasn't always kind. But this casual, organized removal of her child from a room like he was a stain to be cleaned, was something else entirely. This was evil wearing a country club membership. "There's more," Rachel said quietly. "I know you're going to want to do something about this, so I recorded some of it. Not the whole conversation, but enough. I pulled out my phone when I heard them getting louder. I wanted to have something if you needed it." Jennifer's hands started shaking. "You recorded them?" "I know it's not admissible in court or whatever, but I have it. And I'm willing to testify to what I heard, if that matters." What Jennifer needed to understand, what she was only beginning to grasp, was that this moment, this conversation with Rachel, was the moment she stopped being someone things happened to. It was the moment she became someone who happened to things. Her hands stopped shaking. Her thinking cleared. There was a cold, bright anger building in her chest, the kind that doesn't burn, the kind that cuts. She spent the next 3 days gathering everything. She got Rachel's recording transferred to her phone. She called a lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Okafor, who specialized in discrimination cases and had a voice that sounded like she'd won every argument she'd ever had. Jennifer walked through the events of the wedding while Patricia took notes, asking specific questions about what was said, who was present, what the exact timeline had been. "We can't sue the country club directly," Patricia explained during their second call, "because they didn't technically exclude Marcus. The family did. But what David did, publicly distancing himself from you within 72 hours of his family's expressed preference, that's a different issue. And the emotional harm to your son, the way he was removed from a public space based on his race, that matters. The fact that his mother participated in this decision, that she told his family she would handle you," Patricia paused, "this is actionable." What Patricia meant was that David and his family had made a very specific mistake. They'd been explicit. They'd used actual words. They'd created a paper trail, and Rachel had created an audio trail. And now Jennifer had something she could do with that material besides suffer in silence. The opportunity came on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after the wedding. David had texted Jennifer asking if they could talk. He wanted to explain himself. He suggested meeting at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory, probably because he thought it would make Jennifer less likely to cause a scene. He was wrong about a lot of things. Patricia came with her. They sat at a small table near the back of the cafe, Jennifer and the lawyer positioned where they could see the door. When David arrived, he looked tired. He looked like someone who'd spent 3 weeks trying to convince himself that what he'd done was reasonable. He ordered a coffee and sat down across from Jennifer without kissing her cheek the way he used to, without touching her at all. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I should have handled this better. I should have called instead of emailing. But my family, they had concerns, and I needed time to think about what I wanted." "What did they tell you to want?" Jennifer asked. Her voice was very calm. Patricia had coached her on this. Stay controlled, don't let emotion cloud the narrative. David blinked. "What?" "Your mother, at the wedding. What exactly did she say to you about my son?" The color drained from David's face. He looked around, suddenly aware of the public setting in a way he hadn't been before. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jennifer pulled out her phone and played the recording. It was muffled in places, Bathroom acoustics were not ideal, but the words came through clearly. His mother's voice. I didn't raise him to make these kinds of choices. The groom's mother. Standards have to be maintained. His mother again. I'll talk to him about his future. The cafe seemed to get very quiet. People at nearby tables had stopped their conversations. Someone was definitely listening. That's private, David said, his voice shaking. You can't record someone without… Actually, Patricia interjected, sliding a business card across the table. In this state, one-party consent recording is legal, and I'm a witness to the wedding incident itself, so we have multiple avenues of documentation here. What I'd like to visit is your client's liability regarding the emotional distress caused to a minor, the discriminatory treatment that occurred at a public accommodation, and the pattern of behavior that suggests coordinated action based on race. David stared at the business card like it might bite him. I didn't do anything illegal. You publicly distanced yourself from a woman and her child within 72 hours of your family explicitly stating they didn't want that child present because of his race, Patricia said. Her voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it. Your mother indicated she would have a talk with you about your choices, and then you immediately ended the relationship without explanation. That's not coincidence. That's coordination. And that's actionable as coercion and familial pressure resulting in discriminatory conduct. Jennifer watched David's face as he understood what was happening. He'd thought this would be a conversation. He'd thought he could apologize vaguely and Jennifer would accept it because she still loved him, or because she was tired, or because that's what women do. He hadn't expected a lawyer. He hadn't expected documentation. My family didn't tell me to break up with you, he said, but the words sounded hollow. They both knew they were lies. Your mother texted you the night after the wedding, Patricia continued, pulling out a printed document. We have the subpoenaed records. David, we need to discuss your future and your choices. Call me. That was at 10:33 p.m. You called her back at 11:12 p.m. The conversation lasted 27 minutes. Then you sent Jennifer an email at 11:47 p.m. ending the relationship. We have the timestamps. We have the witnesses. We have the recording. David pushed back from the table. I'm not doing this. I'm not sitting here while you… Sit down, Jennifer said quietly. He looked at her and something in her face, that cold, clear anger, made him actually sit back down. You were going to marry me, Jennifer said. Or at least, I thought you were. I brought my 14-year-old son to a public event because you told me it was fine. You told me you'd look after him. And then your family decided he was a problem, and you decided I was a problem, and you disappeared. You didn't even have the decency to say it to my face. She leaned forward. But here's what you didn't understand, David. You didn't understand that I'm not the kind of mother who lets people hurt her child and then quietly accepts an email as an explanation. You didn't understand that there are laws about this. You didn't understand that your mother's text message and your phone call to her and your email to me actually tell a very clear story about what happened and why. This is insane, David muttered, but he wasn't leaving. He was trapped in that chair by the weight of his own actions. Here's what's going to happen, Patricia said. You're going to sign an acknowledgement that you understand we're pursuing a civil suit against you and your family for emotional distress, discriminatory conduct, and damages related to the incident at the Riverside Country Club. You're going to provide written documentation of all communications with your family regarding Jennifer and Marcus. You're going to cooperate with discovery, and if you don't, we'll file a public complaint with the State Bar Association, and we'll make sure that every single person in your firm, your social circles, and your family network understands exactly why. You can't threaten me, David said. I'm not threatening you, Patricia replied. I'm informing you of your options and the likely consequences of each one. One path involves you cooperating, settling quietly, and moving on with your life. The other path involves a very public trial where your family's racism becomes court record. Your choice. David stood up. His hands were shaking. I need a lawyer. Yes, Patricia said. You probably do. Here are some names. She slid another card across the table. We'll expect your response within 10 business days. He left. He walked out of that coffee shop without looking back. and Jennifer watched him go with a sense of profound clarity. This man whom she'd let into her life, whom she'd introduced to her son, whom she'd imagined building something with, he'd chosen his family's comfort over her child's dignity. And now his discomfort was exactly proportional to his betrayal. It was the only justice that made sense. The settlement came through 6 weeks later. David's family's lawyers fought it initially, then capitulated when Patricia made clear she was prepared to make this very public. The amount was significant, enough to cover Marcus's therapy going forward, enough to give Jennifer breathing room, enough to make it clear that this kind of discrimination had a price. David didn't attend the final meeting. His lawyer did. It was a woman named Susan Chen who looked deeply uncomfortable and kept apologizing for things she hadn't done, which was its own form of acknowledgement. But the real victory came 3 months later, when Jennifer's phone rang and it was the Riverside Country Club. Not David, not his mother, the club itself. They were calling to inform her that they were revising their membership standards and their event policies, that several prominent members had made inquiries about the incident, and that they wanted to offer Jennifer and Marcus complimentary memberships and an apology from the board. Apparently, when you make one family's racism very expensive and very public, other people start thinking about whether they want to be associated with it. Jennifer didn't accept the membership. She told them she preferred places where her son didn't have to be made welcome by people who'd tried to exclude him. Marcus didn't ask much about what had happened. He was 14. He understood that sometimes adults did terrible things, and sometimes there were consequences, and sometimes you had to be the one to make sure those consequences happened. On a Saturday in August, months after all of it was resolved, he and Jennifer went to lunch, just the two of them, no boyfriend, no complications, just a mother and her son figuring out how to move forward. Marcus ordered his usual chicken sandwich. Jennifer ordered a salad. And when the waiter asked if everything was okay, they both said yes, and meant it, because for the first time in months, everything actually was. The coffee at home tasted better now. It wasn't bittersweet anymore. It was just coffee, warm, ordinary, absolutely hers.